Not every person with Down syndrome is going to be the first registered lobbyist. That's not going
Right.
to happen. Not every person with Down syndrome is going to graduate with their bachelor's degree. We realize that as an organization. And I realize that as a parent myself, as I talked about some of Mason's struggles. And I think we want to make sure that we're representing our community appropriately. But that doesn't mean somebody who's nonverbal can't have a beautiful life and have their own successes.
Welcome to NICU Heroes, a podcast produced exclusively for NICU professionals, with me, Kathryn Whitaker, as your host. I'm the mom of 6 children, including my very own NICU baby. This podcast is produced by Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit dedicated to providing free personalized support, resources, and community before, during, and after a baby's NICU stay. As a NICU professional, you've been well trained to care for the tiniest and the sickest babies every day. While a NICU parent's scars are not as visible, those parents are often as fragile as their babies, requiring patience, guidance, and encouragement to ensure that they are mentally, emotionally, and physically prepared to endure the pressure of a NICU stay. NICU Heroes is dedicated to helping NICU professionals like you better understand, support, and nurture the entire NICU family. Well, howdy, everybody. Welcome back to another month of NICU Heroes. This month, October, is traditionally known as National Down Syndrome Awareness Month. And so that's exactly what we're going to talk about. You know, it's interesting because last year on our parent-facing podcast, I visited with a mom who had a child with Down syndrome, and her story was so poignant and so vulnerable. And I learned so much that I thought, you know what? We need to have a longer discussion, and we need to bring this discussion over to this particular podcast. Those of you who are working maybe with patients who may or may not know that their child had Down syndrome, they may have known months before, or maybe they're entering the NICU and it's a surprise diagnosis. So I wanted to have someone who had spent time in the NICU, check. Our guest today spent a couple of weeks in the NICU with her own son. Someone who had practical experience with Down syndrome. Yes, Kandi's son Mason has Down syndrome. And then third, someone who advocates for the inclusion and advocacy for those with Down syndrome. She happens to be the president and CEO of the National Down Syndrome Society. So I know that she checks so many boxes, but more importantly, she shares some really great wisdom, practical advice for you as a caregiver, as you're working with patients. How can you be a good NICU professional to them? So I know that you're going to love this interview. My guest today is Kandi Pickard. She's the president and CEO of the National Down Syndrome Society, where she provides vision and leadership, working collaboratively with individuals and organizations to support the entire Down syndrome community. Kandi holds a degree in business administration and brings 2 decades of experience in operations and effective administration management to her role at NDSS. Kandi's involvement in the Down syndrome community first began as a local volunteer and advocate after her youngest son, Mason, was born with Down syndrome. 10 years later, she now leads the National Down Syndrome Society with a focus on building community and keeping people with Down syndrome at the center of everything that the organization does. And you're going to hear us talk a little bit about that. Kandi's vision for the future of the National Down Syndrome Society includes resources, programs, and support for individuals with Down syndrome and their families from birth to adulthood, with a special focus on caregiving, public health, and supporting aging adults. And so with that, let's have an amazing conversation. Well, I'm excited that this month we have a special guest. So Kandi, thanks for being here. We have a lot to talk about.
I'm so excited. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I think that October is traditionally a month that we put a lot of focus on Down syndrome, and I thought you might be the perfect person. So why don't you tell us how you got into your role, like what led you to where you are today working for the National Down Syndrome Society?
Happy to. So in 2012, I was pregnant with my 4th child and my final child, as I always say. And we went into the hospital that morning, and when I had started labor, and after having my delivery, which was fairly smooth for the most part, we found out that my son had Down syndrome. And so that's what really started this journey that I've been on. Mason's now 12 and just celebrated his birthday. But after his birth, I wanted to know and learn as much as I could about Down syndrome. And so that quickly led me down a path to just better understand. And I could share more about my journey if that's something that you want to share about. But his birth was wonderful, but it changed the whole direction of my life, which was, I think, a blessing.
So did you have any indication, like when they were doing ultrasounds, did they see anything?
Nothing. Nope, no indication. And I was high risk because of my age at that point in time too. So they were taking, extra tests and extra precautions just to make sure things were going smoothly. But no, we had no idea that Mason had Down syndrome.
So I'm curious what your reaction was as the mom, but also what the reaction was to the people that were around you, sort of how
Yeah.
they received that news.
So what was really interesting was when Mason was born, he had swallowed meconium, right? And so they kind of swifted him off very quickly, as they do, to kind of take care of him and look. And I had scheduled to have my tubes tied. So I knew that there was this whole process that I was going to have to kind of, have another procedure afterwards. And so they quickly kind of brought him by after the NICU took a look at him. And I immediately noticed some facial features. And nobody said anything to me. It was just quiet. My husband was in there with me, and I noticed the eyes. That was the first thing that caught my attention, was the eyes. And then they kind of took him over to get him cleaned up. And then I looked at my husband and I was like, "You saw that, right?" And he had no clue, as most men, right, sometimes don't. And he was like, "No." And I said, "I think he has Down syndrome." And that was all. And then they whisked me away. This is the
Oh
wildest
my
thing. And they whisked me away into another room to have my tubes tied. And I remember just laying there at the time. My brain was just spinning. Well, what's funny about, or not funny, but I think what was unique about my situation was at the time I worked for the hospital that I had Mason at, and I actually worked with the group of anesthesiologists. So my anesthesiologist at the time he wasn't a chatty guy when he was in procedures. I knew that. I knew him very well. He talked to me for the length of that procedure. He was not going to let my brain do what he already knew was right. I think that as a doctor,
God.
he knew that there was a diagnosis here, but it wasn't for him to share. So he kept me busy and he kept me talking
Mm.
and doing all the things until I could kind of go back in my room and have the opportunity to connect with my OBGYN at the time.
So what did your OB say to you?
So he kind of came over, and at the time Mason was off being cleaned up and being seen and everything else. I didn't even have him at the time. And he kind of came in and he said, "There's characteristics that we are recognizing that look like he could have Down syndrome." And he said, "Do you want me to share more about Down syndrome?" And I remember just kind of sitting there for a minute, just processing it, right? Again, I just sat for a period of time thinking about this, but at the same time, I really didn't know what it meant. It was something that was very still new to me, And so I think he kept talking. At that point in time, I think I kind of was in my own head, and he kind of talked about it. And he did share. He said, "We went back through, we looked at the scans, we went back there and just, right, we looked at everything just to make sure that we didn't miss something." And he said, "There was nothing, there were no kind of precursors or anything else like that. My blood work, nothing." I mean, the only thing I didn't have was an amnio, which they offered to me at the time because I was high risk, and I declined that option at that point in time.
So how did the people around you when you started introducing Mason to people, what was their reaction?
Well, in the hospital, I had a really unique experience because I had bottle fed all my other kids, and I was like, "Oh, this is the one. This is the one where I'm gonna breastfeed this child." And I remember the nurses saying to me, "Okay." And so they had a lactation consultant come in, and the lactation consultant said, "I have a granddaughter with Down syndrome." And that was really one of the first interactions I had with, like, hospital staff at the time that kind of said the words Down syndrome, right? And I was like, "Oh, tell me about her." And so she was telling me about her and telling me how this amazing story about her. And I was just like, "Okay, okay." Right? Like, it was kind of one of those pieces where I was like, that was nice to hear, because I think everybody else, there wasn't a congratulations. And I don't think that my doctor did that purposefully. I think he was just very factual in stating what he found. And even the nurses were just kind of like, we're going to have a social worker come talk to you. But that was really it, right? It was just these kind of precautionary and like, check the box type of things that I think that they had to do before I kind of went back into my room. And so I remember looking at my husband and I was like, okay, what does this mean? Right? Like, what does this mean? And of
Right.
course we went to the last thing. And I tell this to parents every time when I talk to them now in my role, don't go to the Google, right? Do not go to the Google.
Right.
Well, he went to the Google. And so there was a lot of information that was out there. But one of the first things that we saw was NDSS. And so just in a random way of how I ended up, working for the organization. But it was the thing where we were like, okay, let's read some of the facts here. I think that then you have all your friends and family and everybody that wants to come visit, right? And meet your new child. Mason was in the NICU for a while. We didn't get to because they thought that he maybe had some kidney issues and different things. And so he was in the NICU for a while before we actually got to see him. And so I remember calling my parents, and I just remember telling my husband, Ray, I was like, how do we tell them, right? How do we tell them this? Because I really didn't even know what it meant. And I knew those were the
Right.
questions that were going to follow, right? Was what does this mean? And all these different things. And
Sure.
my dad was like, okay, so when do we get to come see him? Right? Like, when do we get to come see him? That's all they wanted to do. I think one of the most, and same with a lot of since I worked at the hospitals, all the nurses that I worked with and the doctors that came to visit me, it was just, we're going to go up and peek at him because they had access to be able to do that. Right. And we're going to go check on him. We're going to come back. And I was surrounded with support and love while I was in the hospital there, which was looking back at it, it was everything that I needed because I think when they all left, I had my moment of, okay, this is a different journey than what I had planned, right? I was looking at my fourth kid, my third son, what I had built up in my head was now different. And so I had to kind of have that time to process those feelings and try to understand what that looked like. Mason had to have surgery within the first 24 hours of being born because he had a duodenal atresia, which was a typical, right? But there was all been those emotions now of having this newborn that then had to go into surgery as well and be in the NICU
Right.
for a couple of weeks after that. So that was good. I think one of the unique pieces was calling my grandma, and my grandma was in her 90s at the time. And I remember telling her that Mason had Down syndrome. And the first thing she said to me, and I tell this story all the time because it hits me, is he said, does he have to go to an institution? That's all
Mm.
she knew. She's in her 90s, right? And so when I think about her experience with kids with Down syndrome or special needs isn't the same as our experience, in 2024, at that time 2012, of having them in school, mainstreamed in school and working in our community and just, living this amazing life. She knew it as they went to an institution. And I remember sitting there, and at first I kind of giggle about it. I was like, no, grandma, right? Like he'll come home with us and he'll be with his siblings. But the more and more I reflect
Right.
on that question that she asked me, it just, I don't know, it opens my mind to thinking of like, that's all she knew. That was her interaction with people with Down syndrome. So it really kind of sometimes drives conversations that I have now in my role of like, we've come so far. Like we've come so far since that point in time. But I have to
Yeah.
say, overall, my experience with our friends and family was supportive and full of love and encouragement. And it was just, I think my husband and I had to kind of get over our own, preconceived notions and trying to understand what the challenges or what the differences were going to be in this new birth journey. But my kids were like, okay, when does he come home? When do we get to meet him? And so that was just wonderful because for them, it was their brother, it was their brother.
Do you think, Candy, that your experience was unique? I know you talked about you had this great group of support. You had people that you knew at the hospital. You had family members who were responding fairly positively. Like, do you think that's typical? Do you find that whenever you talk to people in the Down syndrome community that do they get negative reactions? Do they have a sorrowful conversation with their OB-GYN? I'm curious what sort of what the normal thing is that people can expect when
I
they
don't know
receive
if
that
there's a
diagnosis.
normal. Yeah, I don't know if there's a
Yeah.
normal, to be honest. I think that we hear really great, either even prenatal diagnosis of like, wow, congratulations, right? Like you're gonna have a kid with Down syndrome and they have resources and support, and these families are able to kind of process what that might look like ahead of time. And then even, postnatally, similar to me, I think then you've got the other situations where it's not as encouraging and it's not as positive. My experience with my own genetic counselor, now that's another kind of story for my own personal experience because they did genetic testing, right? I think they have to do that. And she came in and she was horrible. Like it
Oh,
was
no.
a horrible experience that I had because it was just I get the facts. I understand the facts. I worked in the hospital at the time, but it was just kind of like, yeah, you're probably going to have challenges. You're probably going to have going to have to get blood work. You may have more surgeries, and I just remember, I'll never forget it. I was sitting in his NICU room and I think he had just went off to have his duodenal atresia, if I remember correctly. And she walked out and I mean, I just got so emotional. And I just remember looking at my husband. He's like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, that was awful. Like that outlook was awful. And so when I hear other parents or families or grandparents, right, caregivers that are having these unsupportive, conversations with their OBs or genetic counselors or whoever it might be that maybe is giving that diagnosis, it's not positive. And so I take myself back to that genetic counselor conversation because everybody deserves, I mean, at the end of the day, like this is a baby and everybody deserves to be able to celebrate that baby and celebrate this brand new life, right? That's in your
Yeah.
in your family and that's going to bring you such joy and whatever format that might be.
Well, and as we kind of think about how far we've come, I mean, I'm guessing that some of those positive responses may be because people were well educated or they had been around friends or family who had Down syndrome. So maybe let's dive into some of that. What are some of the you think that y'all come across? What are some myths that people have, but what are the real facts about Down syndrome? So maybe explain to people what is Down
Yeah.
syndrome and then some of those myths and facts that are kind of
Yeah.
associated with that.
Absolutely. So Down syndrome occurs when an individual has a full or partial extra copy of chromosome 21. So individuals with Down syndrome may have a shorter stature or almond-shaped eyes. As I mentioned, that was one of the first things that I saw about Mason. Sometimes their ears are a little bit, kind of, I guess, lower than what typically our ears might be. And so every person with Down syndrome is unique and may possess similar characteristics. Another really interesting characteristic of people with Down syndrome is they have a crease across their palm. And I think we all have creases across our palm, but theirs goes directly all the way across. And so it's something that's very special to people with Down syndrome. I would say statistics wise, I think according to the CDC, approximately 1 in every 700 babies in the US is born with Down syndrome. So approximately 6,000 babies each year. So that is something that I think they continue to kind of monitor and see. I think what we find is a lot of our local affiliate groups are the ones that are having a lot of those more direct interactive meetings with new families after they're having their birth. And that was a very similar situation that I had. I met with our local Down syndrome group that came in and provided more information. And I guess it was a little bit more of that direct one-on-one support that I would need once I left the hospital.
So did they come see you because of the social worker or did you have to reach out to them?
So social worker kind of had me write a document that gave them permission to be able to share my information. So because Mason was in the NICU for a couple of weeks, they actually came up to the hospital to meet me and then actually came to our home afterwards to meet with me as well.
That's awesome. I did not know that they did
It
that.
was
That's a great.
great. And I think and that's when you talk about the resources, right? It's even some of kind of the facts and experiences. These local groups, and a lot of times in my basket of kind of goodies that they brought to me is there were resources from NDSS, there were resources, from other organizations, local organizations for more support. There were some books that were in there just about Down syndrome or story. I'll never forget there was one book that was in there called Gifts, and it was all these different short stories, I guess, or quotes from people about Down syndrome. And it was a beautiful story, just kind of sharing their own experiences. And it was just something for me to feel like some connection with as I would sit at night and read. But it also just had sometimes, I mean, I think that mine even had in there like a onesie and, little socks. And it was just a really nice gift. But those are the folks, like we obviously have a new and expectant parent guide, and we have lots of resources that we provide to families on our website or if they call us directly. But we provide all those resources to our local groups across the US. And so they are really, a lot of times the first families or the first groups that families have those connections to just be able to have access to somebody who can answer maybe some questions that they might need answered right away if they, can't get a hold of us or something.
Well, it sounds a little bit like the NICU community. Once you get admitted to the NICU, there's a lot of people who are like, "We
Oh,
know that this is really hard, but also welcome to the club." And
yes.
it sounds like the Down syndrome community may be very similar in that they say, "Hey, either you may or may not have expected this, but welcome. We're happy
Yeah.
that you're here." So it's nice to know that you're not alone. I think that's the one thing that we fear as parents is that maybe this hard thing that we're experiencing or this challenging thing that we're experiencing with our kid, that we have to go it alone. So knowing that we don't have to go it alone, even though, like you said, every Down syndrome case presents differently. Some babies may have more complications or less complications than another. It's, your journey is your journey, but you don't have to do it by yourself. I'm
You
glad to
don't.
know that those
No.
organizations
And social
exist.
media now just offers up so many more opportunities for families to connect and feel that sense of
Yeah.
belonging. So it's one of the good things about social media.
Yeah, there's a few good things. So, I'm curious, I know you talked a little bit about your OB sharing some factual information. The genetic counselor maybe needs a lesson in how to deal with people maybe, but what did you have any fears, Candy, like, as you looked at your baby and that you started to assess? I mean, surgery within the first 24 hours is not a small thing. So, what were some of the initial fears that you had, and did those grow or change as he's gotten older?
I mean, I think there's always fears. I mean, I think with Mason, it was unique because I kind of again, you start reading, right? You hear about, speech delay. You hear about all the delays. You hear about speech delays, low
Yeah,
muscle tone. One of the first things I remember reading was about potty training. And so I just kind of went down this rabbit hole, right? Of like all the
right.
things that people were saying were challenges that they had to overcome. And I kept thinking, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that we can overcome all of these challenges, right? Like, how do our family need to adjust? I think my first probably fear was heart because that's, something that typically is that again, one of the first things that I was again
Mhm.
reading about Down syndrome when I was starting to just understand it. But his heart came back clear and his kidneys came back clear. And so everything started to come back clear so I could kind of move those things away, right? And start to just focus a little bit on, okay, so what's next? I think what our family really tried to do was just look at what was right in front of us at this point in time and not try
Mhm.
to think too far down the road. I'll never forget, we attended our first, Mason was born in March, and we were invited to our first buddy walk in October. As you mentioned, October being Down Syndrome Awareness Month. And I remember going, okay, this is going to be our first interaction. He's a few months old. And I think what what happened was it was great, but then it was also really overwhelming for me as a mom because I was around all these other moms and it was, well, what doctor are you going to see? Have you seen this? Did you get this done? Have you
Cool.
done that? Have you done that? And I was like, oh, whoa, 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 right? Like I have just spent the last few months enjoying my baby. We've got, early intervention happening. Like this is just where we are. And then at the same time, I remember seeing these adults with Down syndrome. And that was overwhelming for me, not
Mhm.
fearful, but overwhelming because I was like, oh, wow, there's this young man that I just met that has a job and he's graduated high school and he's doing all these things. So it was like this overwhelming emotion of like Mason's future. And so I think that when you ask that fear, I think I feared a little bit of like, what does this future look like? But at the same time, I was met with like this overwhelming like encouragement of what his future could be. You didn't ask this, but I'll share it anyways. When I got involved in our local Down syndrome, as we talk about these Down syndrome groups, I got involved probably, I mean, I would say about 6 to 9 months after Mason was born with our local group, and I sat on the board for them. But what my role on the board was to do new parent outreach. And so new babies that were being born, that's just the same experience that I had. I wanted to have that same experience with new families as well. And I met a mom that her outlook wasn't the same as mine. And it was very different. And it was, why is this happening to me? Why am I having to deal with all these extra doctor's appointments and early intervention and all these different things? And I remember, just sitting in my own thoughts thinking, this is night and day from how I feel about my experience. But I think it was that reality of like everybody's experience is so different. And so, how do I,
Yeah.
as kind of that new parent outreach coordinator at the time or that person, how do I not maybe try to get her to where I was, but kind of meet in the middle of like, how do I support that conversation and those feelings?
Right.
Because I think, right, those feelings need to be validated, but also encouraging, right, this opportunity to learn more and to see other options that could shift, right, her vision. But
Right.
that was tough for me. That was really hard for me.
Well, and, we often forget that maybe people's support networks look different, their access looks different, and so that often can, I think, color how you see something, and, but I think you're right, like, having someone just sort of validate and listen and just sort of say, "Okay, so this is where we're starting, and maybe this is a goal of where we wanna be, so let's talk about what's possible, what's not possible." So, I think that that personal, ability to, like, connect with someone, whether it first be the social worker or whether it's your doctor or whether it's a fellow parent, I think gives people some experience to say, "Okay, I'm gonna try to wrap my head around this, and then we're gonna figure out how to move forward," I think is probably more helpful than going to Doctor Google, which is
Yeah,
never a good
right?
idea.
It's the worst thing
Um,
to do.
it's the worst place. Don't do that. Never no, don't go to Doctor Google. I'm curious what your hardest reality or your hardest day was, Candy, and what your best or your biggest joy has been.
I think my hardest reality is realizing how hard Mason has to work for everything. And I think as a parent, right, we never want to see our kids suffer and we always want to try to support them as much as we can. And I think, and I say it's a challenge, but it's like I see him then as he's gotten older, his speech is just like he wants to communicate so well. And I understand Mason, but the other folks don't understand maybe Mason or his speech is a little more challenging for others. So that's always kind of that, little kind of pit in my stomach sometimes of just like, okay, how I see him struggle. And now as he's getting older, his frustration gets a little bit, faster than what it did, a few years ago. And so I hear him say, never mind, never mind, never mind. And so I'm always right re-encouraging him of like, no, let's try this again. And Mason has always been one where he will use his hands or he'll take you or he'll show you if we're not understanding what's happening with speech, right? And so I think that that's always been a challenge area for us as a family. And so that one's a difficult one sometimes because I'm like, physically and physical therapy, occupational therapy, like he gets that stuff and he works really hard with that one. But with speech, this is how we all communicate, right? And so I
Right.
feel like that has always been one where we are hyper focused as a family of how do we make sure that we're providing him with every possible resource or ways to communicate either in school or outside of school to just make sure that he feels that he's heard and that he belongs right in the group that he's with or whatever that situation may be.
Before you go to joy, I wanna ask you this. Did you have a disposition of being patient with your children, or was that something that you've
Great
learned with
question.
him? I'm curious, like, I think sometimes we think that we're patient, and then we're presented with a big challenge, and we're like, "Oh, well, perhaps I had more to learn." Like, how did you work through that, Candy?
Yeah, I am much more patient now than I probably was when Mason was born or with my other kids. I think that I just kind of had this. My husband sometimes has a little bit more of that patient feel or patience to deal with those things. That's a skill that I've had to really work on and learn because I think life is so fast moving, right? And it's just
Yeah.
kind of like, okay, come on, we're going to get this and we're going to keep moving and we're going to go to where I have had to slow down. And I was like, and Mason loves to talk. We just got back from being gone for a couple days. And last night, we were all reunited. And he just wanted to talk and talk and talk. And sometimes I'm like, I just I just want to sit in my own thoughts for a minute. But it's like, no, let's talk, right? Like, let's talk. Let's talk about all the things. Repeat yourself a million times. I don't care, right? Like, let's do it. And so I think it's a skill that I'm continuing to build and learn. And I think the shift in my role and my career has helped with that too, because I see where Mason sometimes struggles or has to overcome, challenges, be it at school or whatever it might be. But then when I get these opportunities to interact with our community, I see different things. And so it's like it may take somebody, somebody may better communicate than what Mason does. And I don't compare at all, but I also see other challenges that may happen in other families, or, people, and I meet people where they are. And I think that's been a blessing for me to be able to do, not only just with Mason, but just across the board with people, right? It's a matter of meeting people where they are and having a really great interaction with them.
I thought people might be curious to know how you grow in patience, maybe when you're presented with
Yeah.
something hard. All right, so greatest joy, what's been the greatest joy of having Mason and someone with Down syndrome in your life?
I think my greatest joy with Mason is seeing the impact that he's had on my other kids and just even our immediate friends and family. I won't even go outside of the bubble because I see it happen outside the bubble, but and he's the youngest of four. And so I see, I have one that's 22, that's, got one more year of high school, one more year of
College,
college
yeah.
left, and he's doing, but he started in business and he shifted to special education. Well, he shifted because of Mason.
Wow.
Daughter's going to graduate, high school next month, and her path is going down a road of either education or physical therapy, but working with students with disabilities, right? So I see these
Wow.
paths, I see this empathy, I see this, as you ask about patience, I see this patience that they've grown, not only for Mason and for our family, but also when they interact with other people with Down syndrome or other disabilities. There's a better understanding, and they walk away from just meeting somebody in the grocery store or whatever it might be. And they take the time to get to know somebody with a disability. And I think I just get emotional about it sometimes because it makes us so much better, right? As people, is when you take that time to get to know somebody in general, but especially somebody with a disability, which is sometimes overlooked or not, or there's stereotypes, right, that go around somebody with a disability. So I think that right now is my greatest joy. I think also with my parents, who again have limited interaction with people with disabilities, watching them, kind of evolve and get involved in our community has been really beautiful as well.
Thanks for giving us a little peek under the
Oh,
hood. I think that's helpful for
absolutely.
people. This podcast is produced by Hand to Hold, a national Hand to Hold is here to support your NICU in two ways. One, you can refer your NICU parents to us for support, or two, you can bring dedicated Hand to Hold support to your NICU, either in person or virtually. Our support consists of one-to-one group and educational resources, including our family-focused podcast, NICU Babies Parent Support. For more information, visit handtohold.org and click on NICU Professionals. There, I think, are certain, preferred words that we use whenever we're around people who have Down syndrome. So let's talk about what you should say and what you shouldn't say. Like what gives their life dignity as opposed to taking it away.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation within the disability community about this because I think that everybody kind of has some preferences. I think we did create a preferred language guide. It's just something that we share quite often, or that we recommend that people read. I think that a person with Down syndrome wants to be, number one, addressed of whatever their name is. If you're talking to Charlotte, hi Charlotte, or they're recognized as a person with Down syndrome, not a Down syndrome person. I think that's
Yeah.
first and foremost. I think that in the US, we say Down syndrome. Now, you go into other parts of the world and they say Downs, or they say, right, Downs syndrome. And so for us in the US, we typically say Down syndrome only. There is some people, will still say Downs. And I think there are some organizations, or there's some individuals who don't like that. And sometimes I know I've heard people correct you in that sense, but I think that we want to address a person with Down syndrome as a person with Down syndrome. That is just a part of who they are. It isn't necessarily what makes them who they are. I think that, I don't refer to you as the glasses woman, right?
Yeah,
It's a
right.
woman who has
Fair.
glasses, right? And so I think it's very similar, similar situation for people with disabilities or with Down syndrome.
So if you, I think if you're around, I know you were talking a little bit about some of the doctors and nurses that were around you. Were there some things that they said? I know you were visiting about your anesthesiologist, but was there something that someone said to you that you were like, "Man, I need to remember that because I need to say that to someone else"?
I think it's interesting. I think of my time when we were in the NICU, and I think that I looked at those nurses who treated Mason as if they were his own, their own child. And I have to say, like, I remember people like that, right? Like you remember those experiences. And so I think it's sometimes in my mind, it's more of that experience of how they made me feel, and which I always want to make people feel that way, right, when I talk to them. I think that I did have a few different nurses and even some of my nurse friends where it was just like, you know, you this is gonna change your life in ways that you don't even know. And I remember just kind of thinking, yeah, okay, sure, right? Like this is gonna change my life. And I laugh all the time because I'm like, never in a million years, never in a million years could you have said to me, you are going to go work for a national, disability organization that focuses on people with Down syndrome, but then you're going to lead that organization. I would have laughed people into the ground. I would have said, you've no way. There's no possible way. And so I think about that a lot where they're like, right, Mason's going to change your life and change others. Like Mason has literally changed my life, changed my whole path, my career, my just vision, my abilities, everything. It's amazing.
One baby can do a lot to a family.
So much, right? So much
So much.
change. So many good things.
So I'm curious, Candy, when y'all first meet with a family, what are some things that you share with them? How do you counsel them to maybe wrap their head around what they're getting ready to face, but also how they share that with friends or family, how they sort of move through the process of having a baby with Down syndrome. What would that look like if I were a new family? What could I expect?
I think what we first and foremost do is listen. I think that a lot of times if we get a phone call or if we meet a family and they've got a prenatal diagnosis, the first thing that they want to do is just be heard. I think that
Yeah.
that's the biggest piece is they want to share those feelings. They want to make sure that they're heard and that they're listened to and that they feel like they're in a safe place to be able to share with that. I think secondly, one of the first things we say to them is like, this is amazing. Congratulations. I mean, those are probably the first words that come out of my mouth, my team's mouth, my board, everybody, because we've had our own personal experiences, right? That just know that this is such an amazing thing that they're going to experience. I think at the same time, we try to answer the questions that they might have. We always want to make sure that we are giving them resources that they may need to just better understand either a diagnosis or if they're, having a procedure or a surgery or whatever that might be, that they have information, facts that are going to be able to support some of their questions that they're going through. And then I think secondly, or, even maybe lastly, is like they have a place where they belong. And so it's a piece where if they pick the phone and they call us back, we're going to pick up that phone and we're going to have a conversation with them. We're available to do that. It's not a transactional type of thing with NDSS. It is very much a relationship. Like if you call us, you are now part of our family. We are going to send you an email. We're probably going to send you a note. Like we want to make sure like we're here when you need us. I think that's the second part. We don't want to be pushy and like force ourselves into your lives, but we are here when you're ready and we're here when you need us. Because I think that as a parent myself, I realize, in this 12-year journey that I've been on, if my role wouldn't be at NDSS, I think my journey would kind of ebb and flow in and out of being involved with organizations just because that's life, and I
Yeah.
think that that changes based on where you are and your family dynamics, other kids, right? All those different pieces that go into it. So I think we always just want to make sure that this family or grandparent, we get lots of grandparent calls, is that they know that they have a place where they belong at the end of the day.
Well, I think that I love that they become a permanent part of the family. It's not like you just send them a thing and you're like, "Buona suerte. I hope it all works out."
We
Like, I
want to
think
hear from them. We
this
want to see them at our events. We want to see them at a buddy walk. Like, it's so interesting. There are so many people that we've met one time and they'll email us like little updates every once in a while, or we'll run into them at, a buddy walk or an event. And they're like, do you remember us? Like we met you so many years ago. And it's like it's like a family reunion of sorts, right? It's just like,
Yeah.
yes, or they send pictures. It's the best thing. It's the best thing.
One thing that I noticed when I was looking at your website, I was scrolling through some of the photos and I saw several photos of people with Down syndrome who are either on your board, like working with your organization. So I'm curious what that looks like what roles they have, what they do for you, and how you sort of integrate them into the life of your society.
Oh, well, thank you for asking about that. I think for us at NDSS, it's so important for us. I mean, who's better to support an organization or say what their needs are or what our work should be focused on than somebody with Down syndrome? And so for us, it's a matter of kind of, I think a lot of people say this, right? Like walk the walk, talk the talk type of thing. But we did want to, I think it was very important to our board and to our leadership to make sure that we had those voices recognized and we had them as part of our integral group that makes decisions on what we do. And so that starts with our board. We have, I think, three board members now, maybe four board members that have Down syndrome that sit on our board. They actively participate in conversations and decisions, just like any other board member that's on my board. We actually have somebody who sits on our executive committee now, which is really exciting. And then on our team, we have our staff with Down syndrome hold different roles. We have the first registered lobbyist with Down syndrome, Kayla McEwen, who is part of our policy and advocacy team. We have Charlotte, who is part of our education, and she does a little bit of policy work with us too, but she graduated with a typical diploma from her local high school. She went on to get her bachelor's degree. And so Charlotte's very much about those early interventions and education and really, driven for change in that place. We have David DeSanctis, who David is part of our public outreach team and our community engagement team. And David is part of making phone calls to thank families for their support or getting people engaged and doing some sort of kind of media and press. David does just a little bit of everything. We have folks that work on our social media side of things. Luke does things over there and Jamie as well. So it's really great. And I think that we always want to, just as I do with any of my team, I want to find out what their interests are so we can best
Yeah.
engage them in any way that we are. I think, my ultimate goal, Kathryn, I think would be to have somebody with Down syndrome like leading this organization. I think that would be, and I think that's one of my board's kind of, goals as well, is how great would it be to have somebody with Down syndrome as the president and CEO of this organization to be able to really lead by example.
Well, I mean, I think that you've integrated it well. I haven't seen y'all in action, but I've seen the things that you do. And I'm curious, Candy, if there's an organization out there that I think wants to include someone, whether their disability is Down syndrome or whether it's something else, what would your best suggestion be to them to say like, "Hey, there's a place at the table. How do we cultivate that place? But also how do we make sure that they're going to thrive and that we've put them in the right place at the right time?" What would you say to them?
My first, I say, just do it. I think that's my first question. Don't overthink it. Just do it. Because I think it's just as it is with any other employee. You find accommodations and you make that employee feel, if it's from an employee perspective or board perspective, like you find out what they need to be successful and we make it work. A lot of times if you're looking at for an employee, for example, there's a lot of accommodations and there's job coaches and different things that are out there to help support the individual with Down syndrome or any disability, really. I think that, we have challenges some days, but I have challenges with other team members too, right? And so I think for us is we figure it out. I think secondly to know is like there's resources out there. So first of all, like if you have questions, how it would work, what all those pieces are, you can reach out to us directly. There's local resources in your community, as I mentioned, around the job accommodation network and different things like that that can help kind of process. Folk rehab is another great resource locally that can provide kind of those more hands-on types of skills. But I think the biggest thing is that if this is a community you serve and this is a community that is important to you as an organization, which it should be for most everybody, an organization at this point in time with social impact, make the effort. I think that you will see business increase, you'll see employee morale increase, you will see all these different things that people with Down syndrome and disabilities bring to your world.
What, when you set accommodations, what might be some of the accommodations that y'all have in place to make sure that they survive, that they're a real asset, and that also that they don't feel like, "Oh, well, they just put me on here because I have Down
Right.
syndrome," like,
It's busy
I
work, right? I think
right,
that's one of
exactly.
the biggest things that we wanna make sure is that our team just isn't doing busy work, that they are actually doing work that we need to do, and they're part of conversation. So I think that, what we always suggest is to employers, for example, is if they're wanting to hire somebody, well, where are your needs, right? Like, where are your needs? What do you need? Do you need somebody to sort mail? Well, if you need somebody to sort mail, I guarantee you there's somebody out there that's gonna be interested in sorting mail. Or if you need somebody to do this task or that task. I think that don't create a whole new job description just for somebody with a disability, but look at what your true needs are and find that person who can help fill those needs. I think secondly, as you talk about accommodations, accommodations could be as simple as, maybe you need somebody who needs something to sit down and do their job seated. Could be somebody who may need to learn how to use Excel and maybe needs to take an online class on how to use Excel if that's a tool, right, that you use within, your day-to-day work pieces. I think secondly, it could even come down to just somebody needing a little bit more time to complete a task, right? And
Right.
just giving those kind of, again, those accommodations or understanding what their needs are to be able to be successful. For some folks on our team, it's like they want to use a particular type of computer versus something else, or they want a mouse, right? A lot of times, what we find out is these accommodations could cost an organization like a couple $100s, right? If even that, when you look at it,
Yeah.
maybe it's an ergonomical chair, right? You never know what some of those pieces are. It's typically not a huge investment. We've seen some success with organizations who kind of set up like I think like a mentorship type of program within their organization. So they do have that point person, just as we all, I supervise people, like they have access to me, but this was a little bit more to where they would meet more regularly, possibly, or once a week, and just kind of like really bring them into your organization in a very unique and special way. There's a group that was based out of New York that would bring them like right to their leadership team retreats and all these different things, so that people were able to interact with this individual with
Right.
disability and see the value that they bring to their organization. And what happened with that is then other departments wanted to hire people, right? It's just this
Yeah.
amazing way. In my opinion, there's nobody I know that increases morale. It will show up to work in the middle of a snowstorm, or they'll, right, get on there and have the best attitude day in and day out. And they have bad days. So I'm not going to say there's not bad days out there, but I think that there's just a value that people with disabilities bring to any, organization or board or volunteer opportunity, whatever it might be.
Well, when we have accommodations in the classroom and sometimes those move to college, it would make sense that we also move them to the workplace and don't see them as, "Oh, this is this thing that we have to do for this person," but look at the small thing that we can do to help them thrive. Like, I think I've seen some of my kids thrive with accommodations, and quite frankly, to other people, they don't even notice the accommodations, only we know what they are. But man, do they soar whenever we put those in place.
And I think sometimes it's just a conversation, right? And asking
Yeah,
what it is.
understanding. So
Mhm.
I'm curious how y'all address, Candy, just implicit bias, maybe with people that you work with outside of your organization, or maybe from the outside looking in, people may look and say, like, why did they hire someone like that? How do y'all address implicit bias and help educate people, but also ensure that you can eradicate that as much as possible?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think our goal as an organization is to shift perceptions. I mean, it's our mission. I think there's so many preconceived notions about Down syndrome, whether you know somebody with Down syndrome or you don't. I think that we want to make sure like our resources and our supports and what we do day in and day out will help somebody better understand an individual with Down syndrome. I think, as we said earlier, right? You meet one person with Down syndrome, you meet one person with Down syndrome. And I
So
think that
true.
that's the unique piece is presume competence, right? Presume that they are able to do something versus kind of jumping into that stereotype of, oh, they have a disability and they're not going to be able to do this. I mean, my son made the honor roll. And if I'm being very honest with you, Kathryn, right, that was never something that I kind of put on Mason's like checklist, right?
Right.
But he did it. And now it's
That's
like
awesome.
they had donuts at the honor
Oh,
roll
well,
breakfast.
there you go.
That was his motivation.
Hey,
And so now that's what he wants. Like that is what he wants. And he strives for every day is to get back to those donuts so he can be on, at the honor roll breakfast again.
I'm also motivated by donuts. So I'm not, I think Mason's onto something there because
Ah,
I mean, I think our motivations come in all sorts of different places and it doesn't really matter what the motivation is, but what an accomplishment. I'm curious, Candy, if there's someone listening to this, typically the people that really focus on this particular podcast are NICU professionals. So they may be walking into a room where, like you were, they have a patient's family who was completely blindsided and had no idea that this was going to be their new life. What would be something that you would encourage them to do or say to that family so that they, like you said, maybe can see the perspective of what could be instead of all the things that maybe they worry about could happen?
yeah. I mean, I think the first thing that I would say is, congratulate them, right? And I think that if they have their own personal stories or interactions with somebody with Down syndrome, like share those because I think that was really heartwarming for me is to hear that they knew somebody with Down syndrome and share a little bit about, right, the life that they lead because it was like, oh wow, okay, this is encouraging to hear. We shouldn't have to do that, but I think that was something that was really nice for me. And I think also just being a resource, and if that is sharing our website or ordering. I mean, you can download our, PDFs of all of our resources, but having resources for them, again, those facts for them to be able to read and to understand and putting them in touch with, a support system that can maybe help guide them through however those feelings and emotions as they happen, and it's okay to happen. I think we all, sometimes realize like we just have to be able to know where we can go to be able to, again, either feel like we're being heard, call us. I mean, you could do anything in that
Yeah,
sense, but I think just being a voice and being somebody who listens and, is encouraging to this family because the Down syndrome community is amazing. And there are so many incredible success stories that meet our community where they are. Not every person with Down syndrome is going to be the first registered lobbyist. That's not
right,
going to happen. Not
right.
every person with Down syndrome is going to graduate with their bachelor's degree. We realize that as an organization. And I realize that as a parent myself, as I talked about some of Mason's struggles. And I think we want to make sure that we're representing our community appropriately. And I know I talked about, a few folks
Mhm.
that are very successful in what they're doing. But that doesn't mean somebody who's nonverbal can't have a beautiful life and have their own successes. Or that doesn't mean somebody who may have other right challenges or health, challenges that come with that they don't deserve to feel like they belong and the families don't deserve to feel like they don't have a place where they belong as well. So I think it's just encouraging that community and knowing that I've never been in any part of any other disability community, but I do have to say that there is something really special about the Down syndrome community, and there are so many people that would jump through hoops for somebody that you've never met before in your life, and it's beautiful.
I'm glad that you said that. I think there may have been someone who needed to hear that. I always ask this as sort of kind of my final question because I love to hear people dream a little bit. So, Candy, over the next decade, what are some dreams and hopes that you have for how society in general sort of reacts to people who have Down syndrome, but also maybe some strides that we may be making in research or in access? Like, dream a little bit with me, and I'd love to hear and also what y'all as a society maybe hope to do or serve the community in an even more inclusive way.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. I've been talking a lot about this, about kind of the future lately, and maybe it's because we're getting ready to go into our next strategic plan. So my brain has been thinking about this. I mean, I think that Number one, we just want to see people with Down syndrome included in every aspect of life, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
in my mind, I always say, how great would it be? And I think that there are hospital systems out there that you have a diagnosis of Down syndrome and you have maybe somebody with Down syndrome that's working at the hospital or part of like, just the everyday pieces. For me, that would be so amazing. But I think as I look at the future of Down syndrome, our population is living longer, and that's coming because of all of the early interventions and early interventions and medical advancements and surgeries and hospital staff that is helping, right, to make our lives longer. And so now our folks are living into their 60s and 70s, where in the 80s they were living into their 20s. So as we look at this
Wow.
aging population, we run into more challenges. And one of those challenges is Alzheimer's disease. There's a correlation between Alzheimer's and Down syndrome. So for me, I would love to see a cure for Alzheimer's, which I know the whole Alzheimer's community would
Yes.
as well. But I think that we also want to see, like, how is this impacting Down syndrome, and how do we make sure, because it's early onset. So for me, I think that's a big space where I would really love to see some advancements. So instead of 60s and 70s, now we're looking into, maybe even into our 80s and 90s, and just that long life for somebody with Down syndrome, and not having to run into that ugly Alzheimer's space. But I think that, I look at there, and I also look at how do we utilize technology to be able to advance those early interventions as well with our community. And so, all these conversations around AI, I don't know as much as I probably should around AI, but in my mind, like, if we're going to do something with them, like, use it for the good. Let's make sure that there's access. I think one of the things we find is there's not access to quality professionals and medical staff who truly understand Down syndrome. So how do we either utilize technology to be able to advance that, or work harder to have more clinics or more physicians or more access for our community to be able to feel confident going to a professional who understands Down syndrome, who's going to treat their loved one as the patient, and right, having that kind of interaction with them. How do we continue to advance those opportunities and those educational opportunities for doctors and medical nurses and staff who are already so busy? How do we make that easier for them, right?
Right.
And I think that that is something that's really important to me, because I don't want a family to go into a doctor and, have an issue and nobody know who they can not know who they can contact to be able to get access to, right, that quality care. So I think those are two big areas. And I think thirdly is just seeing people with Down syndrome, continue to be better represented across the board. As you know, we launched a Barbie this last year,
Yes.
almost a year ago, a first Barbie with Down syndrome. How do we do that in many areas? How do we continue representation on TV? It's happening. It's amazing. It's beautiful. But how do we make it just the norm, and not it being, oh, did you see that there's somebody with Down syndrome that's on this show or on that show or in a magazine or wherever it might be? Let's make that the normal, to where it's just an amazing, beautiful person with Down syndrome that, is always there and always represented.
I love that. Kandi, thank you for all the work that y'all's organization does and for the support that you provide to families. I know it makes a difference, so I appreciate it. Thanks, y'all, so much for listening. That was a fantastic conversation. I hope that you'll do me a favor. If you love today's episode, please share it with a friend. You can also review over on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. You can also give us a listen and a watch over on YouTube. It's how we reach more NICU professionals. Today's podcast episode is sponsored by Reckitt Mead Johnson, whose mission is to nourish the world's children for the best start in life. For more than a century, they have led the way in developing safe, high-quality, innovative nutrition products and continue to push the boundaries of nutritional knowledge with consistent, strong investments in scientific exploration.